hat sich natürlich aktiv betätigt.
His country and many others into the abyss.
The Burden of a Name tells the untold life of Johann Schmidt Jr., born in Austria beneath a shadow that never lifts. His cousin is Adolf Hitler. As the world fractures, Johann fights to keep his humanity and his silence through the rise of Nazism, the chaos of war, Soviet imprisonment, and the long, uneasy peace that follows. This isn't a story about power or politics. It's about the courage to stay gentle in brutal times, and the stubborn light that can live even inside a cursed lineage. The story explores how inherited shame and the cruelty of war shape a lifetime from the rise of Nazi Germany to Soviet imprisonment, and finally, a fragile peace after decades of silence. The Burden of a Name is not about power or politics, but about the quiet courage to remain kind when history demands hate, a reminder that even in the darkest lineage, light can survive. The Burden of a Name. The Boy from Braunau. The year was 1910, and the small Austrian town of Braunau am Inn slept under a soft blanket of snow. In one of the houses near the river, a baby's cry broke the silence of dawn. His name was Johann Schmidt Jr., though he would one day wish he'd been called anything else. His mother, Clara Schmidt, kissed his forehead and whispered a prayer. His father, Hans Schmidt, stood by the window, staring into the fog. He had been quiet ever since the midwife whispered, "He has your eyes." But Hans was not thinking about himself. He was thinking about his wife's side of the family and the shadow that always seemed to follow it. Clara's cousin, Adolf Hitler, had already become a name that people whispered about in the family, not because he was famous, but because he was strange. Even as a young man, he was known for his anger and pride. He had left home to become an artist in Vienna, but letters from relatives spoke of rejection and bitterness. Johann's mother never spoke of him openly, yet she kept one of his early paintings tucked in a drawer, a small watercolor of a church under gray clouds. Sometimes, when Johann asked who painted it, she would just say, "Someone who could have been great." Johann grew up like most children of that time, poor, curious, and hungry for stories. He loved the sound of the train that passed through the valley and often imagined where it might go. The grown-ups, however, spoke in hushed tones about the changing times. Austria-Hungary was trembling. Men were leaving for wars that boys like Johann couldn't yet understand. When he was 6, his father went to the front lines. His mother told him it was to defend their land. He came back 2 years later, broken, coughing, and silent. War had turned him into a shadow. During those years, Johann's only escape was his imagination. He began to draw on scraps of paper small houses, forests, faces. Once his mother caught him sketching at night by candlelight. "You draw like my cousin," she said softly, then frowned. "But promise me something, Johann. Never let your art become anger." He didn't understand what she meant then, but he would. In 1920, when Johann was 10, the family received an unexpected visitor. A tall, thin man with sharp blue eyes arrived at their door. He wore a worn-out coat and carried a small leather case filled with rolled-up paintings. "Adolf!" Clara gasped. The man nodded. "It's been years." To Johann, he looked like someone out of a book, intense, cold, yet somehow magnetic. That night, he sat at their table, eating slowly, speaking of Vienna. "They never understood me," he said. "Those people, they decide who is an artist and who is not. I will show them one day." Johann listened quietly, fascinated and frightened at once. There was something strange about the way his cousin spoke, as if the world had wronged him and he was planning to punish it back. Later, Johann's father whispered to his wife, "He's bitter. I don't like the look in his eyes." Adolf stayed only 2 days, but his presence lingered. Before he left, he looked down at young Johann and said, "The world is cruel, boy. Remember that. If you want to live, don't wait for kindness, take what you deserve." Those words echoed in Johann's head for years, though he never understood them until much later. By 1923, Austria was changing fast. The empire was gone, replaced by poverty and shame. People spoke of the lost glory of the fatherland and the need for someone to restore it. In a smoky tavern one night, Johann overheard men talking. "Hitler," one said, "that painter fellow from Vienna. He's in Germany now, leading some movement, national something." Johann froze. He hadn't heard that name in years. When he asked his father later, Hans only sighed. "Forget him, Johann. That man is dangerous. His anger burns everything it touches." But it was already too late. The shadow had started to grow. In 1924, Adolf Hitler's failed beer hall putsch made headlines across Europe. Newspapers called him the madman from Munich, but they also printed his face thin, mustached, defiant. When Johann saw the photo, he recognized the same sharp eyes that had once looked at him across a dinner table. His mother threw the paper into the stove. "We will never speak of him again," she said, trembling. "Never." Yet silence could not stop history. It could only delay it. As Johann entered his teenage years, he found himself torn between fascination and fear. He wanted to believe that family did not define a person, that he could live his own life, love his own art, make his own choices. But deep down, he knew that his bloodline had already written a story he could never fully escape. Sometimes he would take out his cousin's old painting from the drawer, the one of the gray church, and stare at it. It was beautiful, fragile, human. And that was what frightened him most. Because how could someone capable of painting such gentleness become a monster? The rising storm. Years passed. Europe was still healing from war, but peace was fragile and full of anger. By the late 1920s, Germany was struggling. People were hungry, jobless, and humiliated by defeat. In Austria, things were not much better. Every newspaper headline spoke of chaos, of strikes and protests. And then, almost overnight, the name returned. Adolf Hitler, the posters said, leader of the National Socialist German Workers' Party. The same man who had once carried a paintbrush now carried the dreams and hatreds of millions. Johann was 18 when he saw a photograph of his cousin in a crowd of cheering people. The man looked confident, almost glowing with power. His arm was raised, his mouth open in a shout, and people around him looked at him as if he were a savior. Johann couldn't understand it. How could that quiet, bitter man become a leader? At home, his mother refused to let the name be mentioned. "He brings only shame," she whispered. "If people know we're related, they'll never forgive us." But news traveled fast. A neighbor once said jokingly, "You have famous blood in you, Johann. Maybe you'll become important too." Johann smiled weakly, pretending to laugh. But inside, he felt sick. He didn't want fame. He wanted to disappear. By 1933, Hitler had become Chancellor of Germany. His speeches were everywhere on the radio, in papers, even in the schools. People said he was saving the country, giving jobs, bringing pride back. Some of Johann's friends were impressed. "He's a genius," said one, "a man who knows what Germany needs." Johann never argued. It was safer to say nothing. But at night, when he listened to the radio, his stomach twisted at the sound of that familiar voice, sharp, angry, full of promises and threats. He remembered that same tone from his childhood, the night Adolf had told him to take what you deserve. Now he saw that those words had turned into a movement. Johann tried to build a simple life. He became a schoolteacher in Linz, teaching children to read and write. He painted on weekends peaceful landscapes, rivers, fields. He married a kind woman named Lotte, who loved music and laughter. For a while, he managed to believe that ordinary life could protect him from his family's shadow. But history never stays quiet. One morning, the school director called him in. He was a round man with a red face and a cheerful smile. "Herr Schmidt," he said, "I've noticed your name before. Schmidt. Your mother's maiden name wasn't Hitler, was it?" Johann froze. His mouth went dry. "No," he lied quickly. "No relation." The director nodded slowly, eyes narrowing with curiosity. "Good, good. Because these are delicate times. We wouldn't want the wrong connections to cause trouble." After that day, Johann began signing everything as simply J. Schmidt. In 1936, the Nazi flags appeared in Austria. The crowds were larger now, people shouting "Heil Hitler" with wild devotion. It felt like the whole country was falling under a spell. Johan's younger brother, Ernst, who worked in Vienna, wrote him a letter filled with excitement. "Cousin Adolf is changing everything. There's work now, order in the streets. You should see the parades." Johan read the letter in silence and then burned it. He wanted to believe his brother was right, that maybe things were getting better. But deep inside, he felt dread. The silence of people, that was what frightened him most. The silence of neighbors, teachers, priests. Everyone pretended not to see what was happening around them. By 1938, Austria was no longer independent. The Anschluss had come, Hitler had marched into Vienna, and people had thrown flowers at his feet. From his classroom window, Johann watched the soldiers pass by, their boots striking the cobblestones in perfect rhythm. The sound was terrifyingly beautiful, like thunder. His students, small boys with shining eyes, raised their hands in salute. "Heil Hitler!" they shouted. Johann said nothing. He just nodded, feeling something inside him break. That night, he told Lotte, "We are living in a dream, a terrible dream." She touched his hand. "We'll keep our heads down. The storm will pass." But he wasn't sure anymore that storms always passed. Some storms remade the whole world. One afternoon, Johann saw an old friend, Herr Weiss, a gentle Jewish bookseller who had once lent him a volume of Goethe's poems. His shop had been vandalized, the windows smashed. The old man was sweeping the glass alone. Johann went to help him, glancing nervously at the street. "You shouldn't be seen here," Herr Weiss whispered. "It's dangerous now." "Let them talk," Johann said quietly, picking up a broom. For a moment they worked in silence. Then Weiss smiled sadly. "You are a good man, Johann, but good men are being forgotten." That night Johann wrote in his journal, "Silence is safety." But silence is also sin. The years that followed were filled with fear. People disappeared without reason. Neighbors stopped greeting each other. The air felt poisoned by suspicion. When war began in 1939, Johann was forced to serve as a translator for the army, not a soldier, but still under command. He saw the faces of captured men, the endless trains, the dark smoke on the horizon. He heard rumors about camps, but was told they were just work colonies. He wanted to believe that. He needed to. But in 1942, he heard the truth whispered by a soldier from Poland about mass killings, about gas chambers. Johann vomited behind a barrack and didn't sleep for days. He wanted to scream, to run, to do something, but he was just one man, carrying a name that already made him a suspect in everyone's eyes. When he returned home on leave, Lotte looked older, thinner. The radio spoke of victory, but the city looked like death. "Will it ever end?" she asked. Johann didn't know, but deep down he felt the world was bleeding to death, and his family's name was written in the blood. The fall of the Reich. By 1943, the war had eaten the heart out of Europe. Cities were not places anymore. They were skeletons of stone and smoke. Trains carried soldiers in one direction and carried silence in the other. The radio still spoke of victory, of brave men and new weapons, but everyone could smell the truth. It smelled like ash. Johann walked home through streets that felt like empty theaters. Posters shouted slogans. Soldiers marched with blank faces. Children played at war with sticks shaped like rifles, and their mothers pulled them indoors when sirens wailed. At night, he sat with Lotte by a tiny lamp. They ate soup that tasted like water and fear. She would sometimes touch his sleeve as if to remind herself that he was still there. "Do you think," she asked once, "that people will ever forgive our country?" He looked at the thin curtain, the cracks in the wall, the small dented pot cooling on the stove. "I don't know if they should," he answered softly. He almost said "my cousin," but the words stayed locked behind his teeth. The name was a chain he never took off. In winter, Johann was ordered back to a regional command post. this time not at the front but to handle lists and reports. He read orders with dates and signatures. He read about transports, supplies, work assignments. The words were clean and neat, as if careful handwriting could hide the blood. He tried not to think of Herr Weiss, the bookseller with the kind eyes. He tried not to imagine trains passing in the dark with no names on their doors. But imagination is stubborn. It paints even when you tell it not to. One evening, a young officer came in late with wind-burned cheeks and a laugh too big for the room. "Berlin says the war will turn," he declared, dropping his gloves on the desk. "New lines, new strategies. We will hold." Johann nodded and said nothing. He had learned that silence was the only safe language. When the officer left, he folded his hands together and stared at his knuckles. They looked like someone else's hands. He whispered to the empty office, "There is no turning, only falling." News from the East grew worse. In 1944, people said the Red Army was like a wall of fire. Towns vanished, swallowed by tanks in winter. Refugees streamed through Austria, carrying bundles, children, and eyes that had seen too much. They asked for food. They asked for directions. They asked, without words, why the world had become a monster. At home, Lotta kept a small bag under the bed with bread, a blanket, and papers. "In case we must go," she said. "Where would we go?" Johann asked. She did not answer. They both knew there were fewer and fewer places left to run. That spring, a neighbor whispered that a cousin of the Führer lived nearby. "The Soviets will come for the family first," he said, tapping his nose. "Blood is a map." Johann's throat tightened. He smiled the way a person smiles when they are walking along a cliff and pretending not to look down. "Rumors," he said. "People invent things." But the neighbor's words stuck like burrs in his clothes. Blood is a map. There were days when Johann could not stop thinking of Vienna, years ago, when a tired young man in a cheap coat had sat at his mother's table. The memory felt unreal now, like a shadow from a different world. Could that painter really be the man whose orders covered the continent like frost? Could a human voice turn into a storm? Sometimes Johann took out a small watercolor hidden in a drawer, the gray church with clouded skies, painted by Adolf long before the speeches. The brushstrokes were gentle, almost shy. He would study it and wonder, how can a steady hand make beauty and later bring ruin? He put the painting back each time, as if returning a dangerous animal to its cage. By early 1945, the war sounded closer. The ground itself seemed to tremble. The radio voice was tight now, like a thread about to snap. And then new rumors began, dark and cold. "The Führer is in Berlin, in a bunker. He refuses to leave. He will not surrender." Johann walked to work along cracked pavements and thought of basements, of walls, of underground rooms where light never reached. He thought of a man who had built a world of commands and now lived like a mole beneath the earth. He felt no pity. He felt only the old, weary fear of a name that had been too heavy for any person to carry. At the office, a courier brought a packet of directives stamped with dates and codes. The orders felt meaningless, like instructions for a house already on fire. Johann signed what he had to sign and filed what he had to file. The ash drifting from bombed neighborhoods kept sneaking in through the window frames and settling on the pages. The reports wore a soft gray fur of the city's remains. Then, the day the radios began to whisper a different tune, people went silent in the streets. No shouts, no songs, just the sound of feet and the creak of wagons. It spread like a cold wind. Berlin has fallen. He's dead. He shot himself. The words moved like a slow wave, and each person took a step back as if an invisible tide touched their shoes. Lotta closed her eyes. Johann felt his knees weaken. He sat down on a wooden chair by the window and stared at the afternoon light touching the opposite wall. He waited for relief, for a door to open in his chest. It did not. Instead, he felt a weight settle deeper, as if the earth had reached up and taken hold of him by the ankles. The war might end, but names do not die. They echo. That night, he and Lotta listened for hours to the radio's flat voice. A list of new leaders, new commands, new terms. It sounded like the scraping of a shovel. "Will they come?" Lotta asked at last, barely above a whisper. Johan looked at his hands. "For who?" "For anyone with the wrong blood." He did not answer. They both knew. The Soviets arrived like a storm with no edges. They did not knock. Boots, shouting, doors forced open. Neighbors watched through cracks. Curtains fluttered like frightened birds. Johan had imagined this moment many times. He had prepared words, explanations, proof of his quiet life. But when the soldiers finally stood in his doorway, words turned to dust. "Name," the officer said. "Johan Schmidt." "Family name?" Johan hesitated. A single heartbeat. Enough. The officer's eyes sharpened. "Mother's family." He felt the room tilt. "Hitler," he said. It was as if he had lit a match in a barn full of straw. Handcuffs bit into his wrists. Lotta cried out and caught his sleeve, but a soldier pushed her aside. The officer read from a paper that did not need names, only categories. Relatives, close or distant, all detained. "I am not," he began. "You are blood," the officer said simply, as if stating the color of the sky. "Blood is guilt." They took his small bag from the bed, the one Lotta kept ready. They did not let him kiss her. He turned as they led him through the doorway and tried to remember everything about her face in one glance. The little lines near her mouth, the soft brown of her eyes, the courage she wore like a shawl. He tried to carry that with him as if it could be bread. Outside, other doors opened. Other men were led away. Somewhere a child was crying. Somewhere a dog barked until it was quiet. They pushed him onto a truck with wooden sides. He sat shoulder to shoulder with strangers who were not strangers, at all bookkeepers, clerks, a distant aunt of someone important, a chauffeur who had once driven a party official but hated the man. Each carried a story that meant nothing now. The truck smelled of oil and winter. A soldier climbed up and sat with a rifle across his knees. The engine coughed, then found its voice. Johan stared at his bound hands. He thought of all the words he had not said, all the truths he had buried because speaking them felt like lighting that match. He thought of Herr Weiss, of the Grey Church, of a dinner long ago when a young man told a boy to take what you deserve. He had taken nothing, and yet here he was. As the truck rattled away, he looked back once and saw Lotta standing in the doorway, small as a figure in a painting. She lifted her hand slowly, not in farewell, but in promise. He nodded, a gesture so slight even he barely felt it. The road turned, the house disappeared. The storm moved on. Siberia. The train journey seemed to last forever. The windows were covered with frost, the world outside hidden under snow. Inside the wagon, the air smelled of fear, sweat, and iron. No one spoke at first. They were all too cold, too tired, too broken. Johan sat against the wall, his wrists raw from the handcuffs. Every sound, the rattle of wheels, the clank of metal seemed to count the seconds of a life that was slipping away. He did not know where they were going. None of them did. "Where are we?" whispered a young man beside him. "East," Johan said quietly. "Always east." It was the only answer there ever was. Days passed like years. The guards gave them thin soup and black bread. Sometimes the food froze before they could finish it. Some men cursed Hitler's name. Others prayed. Johan said nothing. He could not curse and could not pray. When the train finally stopped, they were pushed out into a white world that burned the eyes. The air was sharp as knives. A sign written in Russian marked the place. Kolyma, a labor camp. The prisoners were lined up, registered, and separated. Their names were written in notebooks by men who did not look at faces. To the Soviets, Johan was not a man. He was a symbol, a reminder of everything the world wanted to punish. "Name?" a soldier asked. "Johan Schmidt." "Mother's family?" "Hitler." The soldier's pen paused, then continued. "Category? Relative." That was all. No defense, no argument, no trial. Blood was enough. The camp was built in a valley surrounded by endless forest. Wooden huts leaned under the weight of snow. Smoke crawled out of crooked chimneys. Everything smelled of wet wood, sweat, and despair. Every morning before dawn, the guards shouted and the men stumbled outside. They worked with picks and shovels, digging frozen ground for ore that no one would ever see. Their hands cracked and bled. Their feet turned numb. Johan worked beside men from every corner of Europe: Germans, Poles, Hungarians, Austrians. Some had been soldiers. Some had only spoken the wrong words to the wrong person. At night, in the freezing barrack, they lay on straw and whispered memories like prayers. One man, an engineer from Prague, told stories about his daughter's piano recitals. Another, a baker, described the smell of fresh bread so clearly that Johan almost cried. When it was his turn, someone asked, "And you, Schmidt, what did you do before this?" "I was a teacher," Johan said. "Why are you here?" He hesitated. The truth felt like poison. "Because of my name," he finally said. The men nodded. No one asked whose name. In the camp, everyone's guilt was the same. Winter became a monster. The temperature dropped to 40 below zero. Men froze in their sleep and were carried away at dawn, stiff as boards. The guards didn't even shout anymore. Their anger had frozen too. Johan survived by saving crumbs of bread in his pocket, by staying close to the stove when he could, by pretending not to hear when others begged for help he couldn't give. Sometimes he dreamed of Lotta, her voice, her hands, her face in the doorway. In those dreams, she was always warm, always alive. When he woke, the cold cut him like a knife, and the dream broke like glass. He began marking days on the wooden wall with a piece of coal. After a while, the marks became too many, the wall too full. Time stopped meaning anything. One spring, or what passed for spring in Siberia, a letter arrived. The guards rarely delivered mail, but that day, one called his name. "Schmidt, post for you." Johan took the folded paper with shaking hands. The writing was faded, but he knew the handwriting at once. Lotta, "My dear Johan, I am alive. The war is over. They say the camps will release those who are not guilty. I pray that means you. I still wait by the window every evening, though the house is quiet now. If they let you write, please tell me you are alive. Lotta." He read it again and again until the paper nearly tore. It was the first time in years he felt something warm in his chest. Alive. She was alive. He borrowed a stub of pencil from another prisoner and wrote on the back of the letter, "I am alive. Do not stop waiting." He gave it to the guard, though he doubted it would ever leave the camp. Still, writing those words made him believe them. Years passed. Men came and went. Some vanished into the forest, others into the ground. Johan grew thinner, his beard white, his back bent, but his eyes, those stayed sharp. He had learned a strange kind of peace in the camp. When you have nothing, fear loses its power. He began helping the weaker men, giving away his bread when they were sick, whispering lessons in the evenings, small lessons of words and numbers, just to remind them that they were still human. They started calling him the teacher. One day, a guard who had been silent for months came to him after roll call. "Why you always help others?" he asked in broken German. Johan shrugged. "Because someone must." The guard looked at him for a long time, then walked away. The next morning, Johan found an extra piece of bread on his cot. He never knew who left it. In 1957, 12 years after his arrest, the commandant called his name again. "Schmidt," the officer said, flipping through a file. "You are released." Johan blinked. Released. New government. New rules. You go home. Home. The word sounded unreal. Where was home now? The Austria he remembered had been buried under rubble and years. But still, he packed what little he had: a blanket, a tin cup, and the letter from Lotta, yellow and soft from being read too often. They gave him a train ticket and a small loaf of bread. No apology, no explanation. Just freedom, as cold and empty as the Siberian wind. When the train pulled away, he looked out at the endless snow and whispered, "Goodbye." He did not know if he was saying it to the camp, to the dead, or to the man he had once been. Weeks later, he stepped off the train in Austria. The world smelled different of grass, of smoke, of life. People walked quickly, eyes forward. They did not recognize him, and that was a blessing. He found his way to his old street. The house still stood, smaller and older, but still there. He knocked once, twice. The door opened. Lotta stood there, gray-haired, thin, her eyes wide. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then she stepped forward, her hand trembling, and touched his face. "You came back," she whispered. "I told you not to stop waiting," he said. And for the first time in 12 years, Johan Schmidt smiled. The weight of silence. The years after Johan's return moved slowly, like a long, tired breath. Austria was rebuilding, but the wounds were everywhere in walls, in faces, in the quiet that followed any mention of the past. People wanted to forget. Forgetting was easier than remembering. Johan and Lotta lived simply. They tended a small garden behind the house. He taught children again not history, but reading and writing. History was dangerous. Words were safer when they belonged to others. Sometimes when students asked where he had been during the war, he smiled faintly and said, "Far away." That was all. He did not speak of Siberia, nor of the cousin whose shadow still reached across continents. He had learned that silence was the only language the world allowed him. But silence is never empty. It carries echoes. At night, Johan sometimes woke gasping from dreams trains, snow, faces half buried in ice. He would sit by the window, look at the stars, and whisper names into the dark. Not prayers, not confessions, just names. Names of men who never returned. Names of people the world had decided not to remember. Lotta would wake and touch his arm. "Bad dreams again?" she'd ask. "Yes," he would answer, "but they're only dreams now." She would nod, though they both knew that some dreams are only memories trying to breathe. In 1960, a young historian came to the village asking questions about Hitler's family. Johan refused to speak. He told the man, "The world already knows enough monsters. It does not need their cousins." But the historian was persistent. "You could help people understand," he said. "You saw him before it all happened." Johan looked at the man's eager face and felt a quiet sadness. "Understanding doesn't bring back the dead," he said softly. "It only gives the living new ways to judge." The historian left disappointed, and Johan returned to his garden, where he could lose himself among the rows of green beans and sunflowers. The earth didn't ask questions. It simply accepted what was given: seeds, water, silence. He kept the old watercolor in a box under the bed. The gray church Adolf had painted long ago was still beautiful, still human. He looked at it sometimes and tried to imagine the boy who had held that brush before anger, before the speeches, before the war. Once, he showed it to Lotta. "He could have been an artist," Johan said quietly. She studied the picture for a long moment. "Then he chose to be something else," she said. "And you chose not to." Johan nodded. "Maybe that's all that matters." In his later years, Johan began writing again. Not for books, not for history, just small notes, memories, thoughts. He wrote on scraps of paper, on the backs of letters, in the margins of old newspapers. Lotta called it his whispering. He wrote things like, "Guilt is not in blood. It grows in silence. I lived through history. I do not wish to repeat it, even in words. Survival is not pride. It is debt." He never meant anyone to read them. But words, like truth, have a way of escaping. One day, his son, a quiet man who worked in the city, found the papers while helping clean the attic. "Father," he said gently, "people should hear this. It's part of who we are." Johan shook his head. "No. The world has enough stories of hate. Mine is only a story of staying alive." "Then that's exactly why they should hear it," his son said. But Johan simply smiled, a small, tired smile, and turned back to the window. The sky was turning gold. By the 1970s, he walked with a cane. His steps were slow but steady. The children in the village liked him. They called him Grandfather Schmidt. They never knew who he really was. To them, he was just a kind old man who gave them sweets and told stories about stars and rivers, and how every person carries a story inside them, like a small candle. Sometimes he'd look at their bright faces and feel something like forgiveness. Not from others, from time itself. The future belonged to them, not to the ghosts that had haunted his generation. Still, when the news showed documentaries about the war, about the camps, about the man in the bunker, Johan would quietly leave the room. Lotte never asked why. She already knew. In 1984, winter came early. Snow covered the garden, soft and white. Johan sat by the fire, wrapped in a blanket, his hands resting on a notebook. His eyes had grown dim, but his mind still wandered through years and miles, from Braunau to Vienna, from the trenches of war to the frozen nights of Siberia. He wrote his last entry that week. It said, "I was born with a name that history cursed, but I have learned that a man's name is not his soul. Evil does not live in blood, it lives in choices. I chose silence, and perhaps that was my sin. But I also chose kindness when I could, and perhaps that is my forgiveness." He closed the notebook and placed it inside the old wooden box with the watercolor painting and Lotte's letter. The next morning, Lotte found him still sitting by the window, his head bowed slightly, as if he were watching the snow fall one last time. He was gone quietly, peacefully, as he had lived. At his funeral, only a few neighbors came. They knew him as a gentleman, a teacher, a husband. The priest spoke simply. He carried a heavy burden, yet he never let it turn him bitter. There was no mention of history, of blood, of family names. The tombstone read, Johan Schmidt, 1910 to 1985, a quiet man. His son, standing beside Lotte, held the wooden box. He did not know whether to bury it or keep it. In the end, he placed it under the soil beside the grave, whispering, "Let it rest now." Years later, long after both he and Lotte were gone, a renovation worker found the notebook while clearing out the old house. The pages were fragile, the ink fading. On the first page was written, "History remembers monsters. It forgets the ones who survived them." The worker didn't understand who had written it, or why. He turned the page and found the small painting of the gray church, quiet, lonely, beautiful. He framed it and hung it in his shop. No one ever guessed who had painted it. Epilogue: The Lesson of Silence. Time moved on, as it always does. The Hitler family line faded, leaving behind only stories and whispers. But in a small village in Austria, there remained a simple grave with a simple truth: that even in the darkest shadows, some hearts still choose light. Johan Schmidt Jr. was one of them. He was not a hero, not a saint, not a victim, just a man who carried the weight of a name and chose, in his quiet way, to live gently in spite of it. And maybe that, more than anything, is what history truly needs to remember. In the end, Johan Schmidt Jr. leaves us no grand speeches, no monuments, only a quiet record of choices. A man born under a cursed name who refused to pass the curse along. He swept broken glass, shared bread in the cold, taught children their letters when history snarled at truth. If monsters ask to be remembered, let this be our answer. We will also remember the ones who survived them without becoming them. Close the drawer on the gray church, but not on the lesson. Blood is an inheritance. Character is a decision. Carry yours gently, and light someone else's way.